So as I said at the beginning of the show, I want to spend a little bit of time sharing some thoughts I have about my husband, David Miranda, who passed away on May 9th, just a week ago today. And this is not an easy thing for me to do, but it's almost impossible for me not to do it. In part because it's the thing that's central to my mind, but also because David's life and David's influence on me and David's work as an activist and a journalist and then as a politician is probably, I wouldn't even say probably, I would say without question, the single greatest influence on my worldview, on the ethos with which I try and do everything, especially my work. And I think there are parts of David's public life that are truly extraordinary and that contain within it a lot of important lessons that I think are very appreciated in a lot of different ways, but I want to kind of put it together in a way that I think does justice to David and to his legacy. And I think contained within a lot of these events are some really important lessons. Now, obviously, personally, David has been the single most important event in my life. When I met David in 2005, I had nothing in my life that I value back then. I was working as a lawyer in Manhattan. I had never written a single word about politics or journalism. I hadn't written any books. I had no public platform. I had no public voice, something I'd always wanted but couldn't figure out how to get. I was unsatisfied with my life. I knew I didn't want to be a lawyer any longer. It wasn't giving me the opportunity I thought it would when I went to law school to be able to empower the people I wanted to empower, or the causes for which I wanted to fight, in large part because our judiciary is so corrupted in so many different ways, in so many different aspects. And I came to Brazil in 2005 in large part because I knew I was on the wrong path, not the path I wanted to be on, but I had no idea how to get on the path I wanted to be on. And I decided I would rent an apartment for 7 weeks in Rio de Janeiro, a city I had visited many times and was in love with from the first time I visited there, basically to just clear my head, spend my days walking on the beach, and figuring out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. And I came to Brazil, I took my dog, we got into Rio de Janeiro late at night. I woke up the next morning, the first thing I did was go to the beach. On the very first day I was in Brazil, within, I would say, 2 hours after waking up and getting to the beach, I was sitting there reading the paper, having a drink. A volleyball came and knocked over my drink, and then a Brazilian man came over to me and apologized for having knocked over my drink, and we looked at each other and we began talking. And I didn't think it was possible, but we actually fell in love on first sight, and from that moment we were completely inseparable. And we ended up marrying and being married for 18 years. 6 months after I met David, started a blog, began my journalism career. At the time, it was impossible for us to live in the United States because the U.S. had a law in place called the Defense of Marriage Act, signed by Bill Clinton with overwhelming bipartisan support, that banned the granting of any legal rights by the U.S. government to any same-sex couple, including immigration rights. So if David had been a Brazilian woman, I would have been able immediately to get a green card for him and live in the U.S., but because he was male, that was impossible. So our only way to be together was to stay in Brazil. Ironically, Brazil, despite being a very socially conservative country, despite its reputation, the largest Catholic country in the world, had created the right for its citizens to get immigration rights for their same-sex partners, because the alternative, having to separate from the person you most want to share your life with, was viewed by the courts as so inhumane that they created a right, even though same-sex marriage was not legal in Brazil, for Brazilian nationals to obtain permanent immigration rights for their same-sex partners. So I was able to obtain a permanent visa to be in Brazil, to work in Brazil, but that meant I couldn't work any longer as a lawyer, and that kind of forced me to abandon the work I was eager to leave behind anyway. And within 6 months, I had created a blog Within less than a year, I had a contract to write a book about the war on terror and the civil liberties assaults it was fostering. And essentially, David was my biggest fan from the very beginning, always pushing me to do more. He designed my journalism career. Whenever I got content, he would say, "This isn't enough, you need to do more." He just somebody who was constantly affirming and believing in my full potential and not ever letting me stagnate. There would be no show of this kind. You would not know my name. There'd be none of the work that I did without David. He was completely integral and fundamental to everything that I did. We ended up adopting children in large part because it was his dream and not mine, and it was the greatest choice I ever ended up making. The thing I value most in life is our children that I also would not have if not for David. But he too transformed as a result of our marriage, and he was somebody who hated politics at the start of our relationship. When journalists would come to Brazil or we had to travel to the US, and we'd have to go out to dinner with people in media or politics, he would always say, "I'm not going, you're just going to talk about politics the whole time," and completely uninterested. That's the most boring world possible. He wanted to go to school for marketing. He loved video games. He wanted to do marketing for Sony or for new technology companies. That was really his passion. And he did go back to school and get a degree in that. And the origins of David's life are just by themselves truly amazing. David was born to a single mother, and he's talked about this before. He was born to her while she was living in one of the most deprived communities in Brazil, in Rio de Janeiro, a favela where there was no drinking water, no sewage, no access to any minimum basic service. They were beyond poor, and his mother worked as a prostitute to sustain him. She had 3 other children before David. He was her 4th. And that was his start in life. And when he was 5 years old, his mother died, leaving him an orphan. He never met his father. And an aunt of his, even though she had 5 children of her own, was working as a domestic worker, facing extreme poverty of her own, all kinds of difficulties, took him in and saved his life and gave him a chance for life, which he would not have had. He would have ended up on the street or in a shelter, completely consumed by a society that has incredible amounts of income inequality. Brazil is not a poor country. Brazil is a rich country. It has immense resources, commodities, oil. Sao Paulo is the center of hedge fund capitalism and banking in Latin America. It's just the distribution of resources is so unequal that there's no class mobility. If you're born poor in Brazil, with very few exceptions, you stay poor. And yet David, despite having a relatively short life, he died one day before his 38th birthday, was able to achieve so much in such a short time despite that beginning. In fact, I would say because of that beginning, he was able to achieve so much. He had to stop working at the age of 13 because he needed to work to support himself and his family. So he stopped his formal education at 13. And yet when I met David, I would say he was probably the single smartest person I have ever met. I don't just mean street smarts or intuitive smarts, though he had those in abundance. I mean intellectually. He just had read so many books. He had mastered a large amount of English by the time we met through films and video games. And David was a pioneer in so many ways. So I just want to talk a little bit about what that public part of his life entailed, because it's just extraordinary, and I think it should be told, but also there are some, like I said, some really valuable insights that we can take from that. So the first time that David ever really emerged in the public spotlight was as a result of his truly crucial role in the Snowden story. As some of you might recall, and here's the New York Times article on it, the headline there says, "Brazil detains the partner of a reporter tied to leaks." And the article says, "The partner of Glenn Greenwald, the journalist for The Guardian, who has been publishing information leaked by the former NSA contractor Edward Snowden, was detained for 9 hours by the British authorities under a counterterrorism law, while on a stop in London's Heathrow Airport during a trip from Germany to Brazil," Mr. Greenwald said Sunday. Mr. Greenwald's partner, David Miranda, 28, is a citizen of Brazil He had spent the previous week in Berlin visiting Laura Poitras, a documentary filmmaker who has also been helping to disseminate Mr. Snowden's leaks to assist Mr. Greenwald. The Guardian had paid for the trip, Mr. Greenwald said, and Mr. Miranda was on his way home to Rio de Janeiro. Now, what actually happened there, the New York Times being the New York Times, minimized everybody's role and everybody's work, is that Laura Poitras and I weren't helping to disseminate Snowden's leaks. We were the journalists who were reporting on this archive that he had given us. He had chosen us. We flew to Hong Kong. There was a Washington Post reporter involved, and the Washington Post refused to let him fly to Hong Kong to meet with Snowden because of how dangerous and risky that was. Laura and I went and met with went with Snowden. That's where we got the full archive that he had given us. And when I got back from Hong Kong and began doing the reporting that was incredibly destabilizing to the U.S. security state, it revealed that they had been spying on the U.S. population indiscriminately by the billions, even though 3 months earlier, before we began the reporting, James Clapper, Obama's senior national security official, had gone to the Congress and when asked by Senator Wyden whether the NSA was spying en masse on American citizens, explicitly lied and said they were not. And among the documents Snowden gave me was the proof in the form of a secret FISA court warrant that was ordering phone companies to hand over to the NSA everybody's record of phone calls, with whom we were speaking, for how long, where we were when we were speaking, incredibly invasive information, none with search warrants about people based on suspicionless searches. And there were diplomatic ruptures as a result of the reporting we were doing, and the US government got very threatening. James Clapper and other senior Obama administration officials had explicitly threatened that either Laura Poitras, who was in Berlin at the time doing the reporting, when she got back from Hong Kong, she went to Germany, or myself, who was doing the reporting in Brazil, could be arrested if we left Brazil or if she left Germany. And there was recent reporting over the last couple of years by Mike Isikoff in the Yahoo News that reported that there was an assassination plot developed by the US government against Julian Assange. And part of that reporting was they were also attempting to develop theories to prosecute both myself and Laura Poitras for doing the reporting. So it was a very dangerous time. We had access to the most secretive documents by the most secretive agency in the world's most powerful government. And I didn't leave Brazil for 11 months. Laura didn't leave Germany for 11 months. We stayed there and did the reporting. And Laura began working on the film that she had taped while we were in Hong Kong. With Snowden's permission, she recorded every single moment that we were with Snowden in Hong Kong. And what happened was, when I got back to Brazil, there were 5 or 6 different segments of the archive. Each had its own encryption key, each had its own password. Snowden was obsessed with protecting this archive with the most sophisticated encryption methods that he had learned at the CIA and the NSA. And when I got back to Brazil, I saw that one of the segments of the archive that I knew contained some of the most important documents had become inaccessible, because somehow in the course of these very tense moments in Hong Kong, the password that I ended up having for this part of the archive, and that Laura also had for this part of the archive, was incorrect. It just would not give access to this part of the archive. And I was desperate to get into this part of the archive because I knew it had some of the most important stories, and it did. And so through an amazing stroke of, really a miracle, Laura was able to decipher what that password was after weeks, even months of trying, because she was filming Snowden so continuously when we were in Hong Kong that she discovered, as she began editing what became the documentary Citizen 4 about our work with Snowden in Hong Kong that won the Academy Award in 2015 for Best Documentary, she discovered she had the raw footage of Snowden entering the password to that part of the archive before he gave it to us. And even though it was from an angle that wasn't directly on the keyboard, she was able, through guesswork, it took her weeks to figure out what the password was based on how he was typing. And so she told me she finally got access to this part of the archive. And so the question became, how was I going to get this archive in Rio de Janeiro? She obviously couldn't mail it to me. We were among the most surveilled people in the world at that point. The proof emerged that that was the case. That was obviously not paranoia. We were being spied on by the US, the UK, and probably every other major government in the world because of the work we were doing. And by that point, Laura had decided she no longer trusted The Guardian. And so The Guardian offered to send somebody to pick up the archive and take it from Laura and bring it to me. But by that point, Laura no longer trusted The Guardian. In fact, she was unwilling to give it to anybody. And David stepped up and he said, let me go to Germany and get this part of the archive from Laura. And I'll bring it back here, and that way you can work on it. Most likely, they won't know what I'm doing. We knew there was a great risk, though, because we knew they were watching everything we were doing and spying on our communications. We used encryption. We tried to be as careful as we could, but David knew it was very dangerous, and he was adamant that he'd do it, and he was the only person Laura trusted. She had visited Rio de Janeiro several times, and she told me, David's the only person besides you to whom I will give this archive. I couldn't travel. David was the only choice, and David, knowing the risk, decided to go to Germany to get this archive because he was so determined to make sure we could report the entire archive. He went to Berlin to meet Laura. He got the thumbnails, the thumb drives with those articles, with that part of the archive, and as he was coming back through London on his way home to Rio, he was detained by British authorities at the airport. He was held under a terrorism law. I will never forget the day that the British authorities called me to inform me that they had arrested him and detained him under this terrorism act. And one of the things David ended up saying that I didn't realize at first was, when you're not American or not British, and it was clearly in part because David was Brazilian that they detained him. There were all kinds of journalists with far more closer proximity to Snowden than David, but they were British and American. They had gone in and out of Heathrow many times without getting stopped. They stopped David because they knew they could. And if you're not an American citizen at this time, 2013, and you get accused of terrorism, crimes involving terrorism, you know the US and UK governments are unlimited in what they do to people, sending you to Guantanamo, torturing you, putting you in prison with barely any due process. And they threatened David all day with doing exactly that, with prosecuting him, with putting him into prison. And it was only because the Brazilian government so vocally objected and essentially insisted to the UK that they release David that he was finally released after 12 hours. And he came back and he got radicalized. That's what politicized David. That's what led David to conclude, is he told me that maybe you want to avoid politics in life, but politics will not avoid you. And he was so enraged by what had been done to him that he sued the British government, and he won. The highest court in the UK, as you can see from this January 2016 article, ruled that, as the headline says, the UK court in David Miranda's case rules that the Terrorism Act, the act that they used to detain him, violates fundamental rights of a free press. Quote, in a case involving the seizure of secret documents leaked by Edward Snowden, a sweeping British counterterrorism law has been ruled incompatible with journalists' rights in a landmark decision. Quote, a British appeals court has ruled that the United Kingdom's broad counterterrorism laws breached fundamental rights in a case involving the seizure of encrypted documents from David Miranda, the partner of Intercept co-founder Glenn Greenwald at a London airport in 2013. So he was really able to change the law to prevent the UK government from ever again using this act against journalists. Here you see from The Guardian, a similar article reporting on that case that David brought, quote, Terrorism Act incompatible with human rights. Court rules in David Miranda's case. Appeals court says detention of Miranda was lawful, but the cause under which he was held is incompatible with European Rights Convention. And then it goes on to summarize what the court ruled. Now, that was an incredible thing David was able to do, and he did it knowing that he could provoke the British government further. They were threatening criminal prosecution against him. He didn't know if he'd be able to ever travel again outside Brazil, and yet he didn't care. He was so infuriated by the threat to journalism that his detention posed that he fought the British government all the way to the High Court. This is somebody who never wanted to be involved in politics, who told me that he wanted to stay as far away from politics and journalism as he could, but realized at that point that that wasn't necessarily a choice that he had. Now, when David died last week, it was really extraordinary to watch the reaction. The president of Brazil, Lula da Silva, lamented David's death. He said, "My condolences to Glenn Greenwald and his family for the loss of David Miranda, a young man with an extraordinary trajectory who left too soon." Now, the amazing thing about this tweet from Lula is that David, before the 2022 election that Lula won, was in a left-wing party in Congress. He was representing Rio de Janeiro in Congress, and this party had always been known as a party that was built to oppose Lula's party from the left. It was a party that in 2004 was formed by dissident members of Lula's party who left in objection to what they perceived as the corruption in the Workers' Party under Lula, but also because of neoliberal policies. Lula was doing business with large corporations, with the media corporations, with all sorts of corporate power centers that members of Lula's party thought they were there to oppose, and so they created this dissident party, this anti-PT party, and David joined that when he became, in 2016, he ran for city council. He became the first ever gay man in the history of Rio de Janeiro to be elected to the Rio de Janeiro City Council, an extraordinary thing given David's origins, and then in 2018 became a member of the Federal Congress. And in 2022, his party decided for the first time ever that they were going to support Lula in the first round of voting in the 2022 presidential election. And so desperate was the entire Brazilian establishment to defeat Bolsonaro that even longtime enemies of Lula all united behind him. The entire Brazilian left united behind Lula, almost every major institution united behind Lula. And David decided that he didn't go to that party to march behind Lula and his party. And so David became the first nationally known left-wing politician to stand up and say, "I refuse to support Lula's candidacy." He left his party to join a different party to support a different presidential candidate, Ciro Gomes, who was more of a center-left candidate, I suppose you could say. And David knew that by doing that, he was risking his political career. There was a war waged on him by the left when he decided to do that because it was important to punish anybody who stepped out of line and refused to support Lula. And David knew that his political career would be much easier if he got in line behind Lula, and yet he didn't, and yet Lula still felt compelled, in what I think is a very heartfelt way, to lament David's loss because of how important he was to the country, what a powerful symbol he is to Brazil. Lula's successor as president, Dilma Rousseff, whose government was the one that got David out of British custody by so vocally objecting, said similarly encouraging things about David. Quote, "David Miranda left too soon. He had a lot to live and build. He was a dedicated and respected parliamentarian, respected by all. My condolences to your family, Glenn Greenwald, and to your children." Rafael Correa, the former president of Ecuador, who was the one who gave asylum to Julian Assange, infuriating the West by doing so, also tweeted about David and lamented his loss. The New York Times, the Washington Post felt compelled to run obituaries about him. It is really amazing for somebody to be born as an orphan in one of Rio de Janeiro's most deprived cities and in just 37 years have an impact of this kind on the world. But I want to show you a couple videos about David because though he did become a left-wing politician, he was really very heterodox in a lot of ways, especially as he evolved over the last several years, where he hated above all else polarization and ideological dogma and the prohibition, especially that comes from the left, on having relationships with or communicating with people who are not on the left. He was a very firm advocate in the need to have dialogue with everybody. he went on the show that at the time was probably the biggest podcast in Brazil. It was kind of the program of Brazil's Joe Rogan, whose name is Monarch. I talked earlier that he ended up being canceled and censored by YouTube, and his show was canceled. But this was before that, when everybody was dying to go on that show. It was watched by millions of people. And David went on before the campaign, and he said a lot of things that really angered the left, including the fact that he believed that whether to get the COVID vaccine should be optional, that it's outrageous to punish people for not getting the COVID vaccine, that it should be done through persuasion and not coercion, which was a heretical view on the left. But I just want to show you a couple clips. We put the English subtitles on that really gives you a sense for the kind of spirit in politics that David tried to spread, oftentimes at real risk to his political career.
Às vezes você quer questionar alguma coisa que está acontecendo na sociedade e você é cancelado, porque tem certas palavras que você não pode utilizar. E se você quiser questionar aquilo ali, existe uma gama de pessoas que está te cancelando. E aí é foda, porque você não consegue ter diálogo. Por exemplo, a gente vindo aqui hoje, já lá no meu Twitter, já vi um montão de gente me criticar, porque eu tô vindo aqui no programa dialogar com vocês e com milhares de pessoas que estão aqui, que tem uma ideia da esquerda e das políticas que são feitas que é completamente diferente. Como é que a gente vai ter diálogo num país que está rachado, que está com a economia completamente acabada, para a gente poder dialogar, porque essas pessoas têm um voto consciente no próximo ano e que seja um projeto de reconstrução do nosso país? Como é que a gente vai dialogar se a gente vai ficar nas nossas bolhas? Então, assim, acho que tem que ter diálogo, como eu faço no parlamento. Eu faço muito diálogo com todos os setores lá dentro, sabe? Inclusive no Rio de Janeiro. No Rio de Janeiro, eu tive que dialogar com o Carlos Bolsonaro e eu consegui passar o nome de transgêneros e travestis, o nome social, no Rio de Janeiro, com o Crivella sendo prefeito, com o Carlos Bolsonaro e com uma bancada ultraconservadora. Por quê? Porque eu tive diálogo com todo mundo ali, explicando o que era o nome social, o que significava para aquelas pessoas, entendeu? Então eu consegui passar aquilo lá.
That was really true. David was able to get laws passed because he formed friendships with even the pro-Bolsonaro camp. And they would have fights in public all the time, but David was just a person who was impossible to dislike. Everybody really liked and respected him, and he was able to use that to get support from conservatives, from the Bolsonarista camp, for laws that he was able to get passed that he believed would benefit the people who had sent him there. This is another clip where he talks about vaccine mandates and what was becoming the increasingly repressive, not just the policies around COVID, but the attempt to ban any debate over what our COVID policy should be and the role that Big Pharma was playing in it. And this too was absolutely heretical on the left. But he never thought that way. He never cared. He said what he really believed, and it came from this spirit of humanitarianism way more than it came from a spirit of ideology or party. Listen to what he said here.
A gente não fala o quanto que as farmas estão faturando com isso. Então, assim, a gente foi muito rápido a vacinação. Assim, temos que tomar. Funciona a vacina, a gente está vendo aí que os números de casos caíram, aí funciona. Isso é uma coisa que a gente tem que colocar, realmente funciona, só que aí agora vem uma terceira dose, talvez uma próxima quarta dose, e por aí vai. E o quanto que essas farmas vão estar ganhando em cima de um discurso de que você precisa tomar porque só funciona 6 meses. E se você tiver Covid, você não tem anticorpos, não é suficiente. Até quando a gente vai ficar refém disso? E aí, se você fala disso num debate, filosoficamente, só para poder falar sobre economia, sobre tudo, não, aí você é antivacina, você já é cancelado. Você não pode ter esse debate dentro da sociedade, porque você não tem espaço.
E esse é o ponto.
Esse é o ponto,
acabar com o debate.
Porque
se não você acaba o debate, o que você
tem
que fazer?
E quem que vai acabar com o debate? São aqueles que estão ganhando, aqueles que estão lá na estrutura de cima.
So, like I said, I mean, you see there, David believed in the vaccine at the beginning. But he also knew that there was a lot of profiteering going on with it and a lot of attempt to basically hold us captive to vaccines and to medications by Big Pharma that we were really not even allowed to question. And the fact that there was debate closed around all these issues is the thing that offended him most, because the idea that any of us are the owners of truth is just something that David instinctively rejected. I wrote a story after David was hospitalized, that I think really, to this very day, has such an impact on me, and I think really captures the best of David and what made him so unique. There's this figure in Brazil. His name is Cabo da Ciolo. And he first came to prominence in around 2010 because he was a firefighter. And he was one of the leaders of his union. And the firefighter union decided to go on strike because they had incredibly low wages. I mean, barely poverty sustaining wages. It was barely the level of subsistence. So these people were running into fires, rescuing people in dangerous situations, and they barely could even afford a house or food or anything. And so he led this strike. Unions aren't always very popular in Brazil, but Cabo was so charismatic, and so he spoke about the need to treat people like firefighters in a humanistic way from a religious perspective. He's a fanatical evangelical. He's an evangelical pastor. So he's used biblical verses to talk about the way we treat others, and he became this political star overnight. He's a very good-looking guy, this very charismatic guy. And it was finally something that the left has always craved in Brazil and elsewhere, but is very difficult for the left these days to find, which is an actual working-class person who speaks genuinely from religious values and working class values, but also uses it to support the idea of treating workers and people in poverty and people deprived in a better way. And Cabo became an overnight star. He went to the same party that David ultimately joined, ran for Congress, and after about 2 years in Congress, he began speaking too religiously. And he began advocating things like changing the Brazilian Constitution, to talk about how rights come from God. He was also opposed to same-sex marriage and got a perception that he was homophobic. And so this party, this left-wing party that has long been filled and dominated by intellectuals and professors, just like Western leftist parties so often are, finally had a working-class person, but he was too religious, too homophobic for them to tolerate, and so they expelled him from this party, and Cabo got mauled by the Brazilian left as being someone who hates LGBTs and is bigoted and homophobic. He ended up going to a different party. He ran for president. He got way more votes than people expected in 2018. He really became a beloved figure. And in 2022, he was planning on running for Senate, and David and Cabo found themselves in the same political party. And they formed this extremely close friendship, obviously a very improbable friendship, one of the most prominent, if not the most prominent, gay politicians in the country, the person who was first elected, the first ever gay man elected to the Rio de Janeiro City Council, someone who's in a same-sex marriage, who advocates same-sex marriage, and on the other hand, a politician who is known for being an evangelical, for opposing same-sex marriage on religious grounds, and who was perceived as an anti-gay bigot. And yet, they didn't care. They completely overcame these differences that they were told should divide them, and they just loved each other. They were constantly speaking and hanging out at these political events, and David would post photos of him with Cabo online and talk about how much respect he had for Cabo, and Cabo would do the same. And Cabo's followers were often angry, but David's supporters were infuriated that David would have this friendship with Cabo. And when David was hospitalized, and in the first week, we were told he probably would not survive that first week, that the chances were overwhelming that he would die, Cabo called me and shared with me biblical verses that came from the heart that I found incredibly comforting. He was insistent that he wanted to go visit David. He went and visited David multiple times and told me he didn't want any publicity. He didn't want any media there. He didn't want it even to be known that he was visiting David because he didn't want any hint that he was doing it exploitatively. He went and prayed with David, prayed over David. And while a lot of politicians did that the first week and then went away, Cabo never stopped. He continuously visited David in the hospital. He continuously called me. He went to David's funeral last week. And I find that so inspiring that, if you go online and mention Cabo's name, all you'll hear is that this is the person who hates gay men and lesbians. And yet, for the last 9 months, Cabo was one of the people who spread the most love and the most comfort when it came to David and me, and talked about our marriage and our children and how he wanted to bring his wife to meet our kids. And it's such a lesson in how you judge another person. Tons of people online who put rainbow flags in their Twitter bios or the right hashtags attacked David using all kinds of homophobic themes when he left his party because he didn't want to support Lula, when he started engaging in these more heterodox views. And yet the person who Twitter will tell you, or the political discourse will tell you, hates gay men and lesbians, is somebody who, through sheer affection and love for David and respect for us as a family and as a married couple, lent so much support for no benefit, purely from the heart. Let me show you just a couple more things. In September of 2017, David and I went back to the UK for the first time since he was detained under that terrorism law. And we knew there was an open criminal case. And we tried to get our lawyers to get assurances from the British government that we could go back to the UK and not have any problems with the law or with David getting detained again or arrested. And they refused to give it to us. But David was insistent on going back. And we did an event where we talked about the Snowden reporting and the threats of the British government. You may remember the British government sent agents into the newsroom of The Guardian and demanded that The Guardian physically destroy the laptops on which they were working with the Snowden files. And the Guardian journalist said, this achieves nothing. There's copies all over the world that Glenn Greenwald has, that Laura Poitras has, that you're not going to be able to destroy. And the British authorities were so tyrannical that they stood over the journalists at The Guardian, the editors, and forced them to physically destroy the laptops and the computers with tools upon threat of physical prosecution. So when we went back to the UK, we were very concerned about what might happen. And so we went back anyway, and we did this event, and here was David talking about why he decided to take that risk to go to Germany and pick up that part of the archive, knowing that the dangers were very high.
I came from the favelas in Rio de Janeiro, and I'm LGBT. And why did I did what I did to help Snowden, Glenn, and that time, and Laura, what we did? We learned very young that that is just a path that you have to take. When you are so young in that kind of environment, you have to be strong for the world. And that's what we did. When I got detained here, everything has completely changed. I will tell you, it was one of the hardest times, but it was one of the most bravest times because I look up to my husband, I look up at what Edward Snowden was doing, Laura Poitras did, and that time, and many other journalists around the world. And I could not be just standing there and not fighting alongside of them. 4 years later, I'm here in front of you. I choose to come because we battled and we won. We won. We won. Journalists are not going to be more stopped in this country under that terrible law. We won. I came with fear that they're going to do something to me. But I learned back there, with fear, that's how you do it. So just one more thing. It's just good to be here and say, fuck you, GHQ.
So I think you can see there, one of the reasons David touched people all the time is because he was just such a man of passion and emotion and was not afraid to show it. He was very imposing physically, very strong physically, but every time he spoke, it was from the heart. And he moved people so much. I mean, when he died, Snowden paid this tribute to David, saying that of all the people involved in the Snowden story, I think David was the purest, the one who did it with the purest motives. No thought of material gain, no thought of fame, no thought of anything other than this incredibly genuine commitment to this cause and this belief that he learned from when he was young that if you believe in something, you fight for it. That's the only way you get things. It's the only way you get anywhere. The mayor of Rio de Janeiro came to David's funeral and didn't ask to speak, but spoke afterwards to reporters and talked about how David was so important to the city because he's an example to so many people in Rio and Brazil generally who are poor and are taught that that's their place, and that he was an example showing people you don't have to accept that with courage and devotion and determination, it is possible to break out of that. It's not easy, and sometimes it takes luck, but he was an example that inspired people to have belief and faith in their future if they're willing to do the things necessary. I think we have one more before I just share a couple thoughts. Okay, so yeah, there was one more video, but we don't have that. I think it's fine. I think it really shows the kind of the way that David entered politics was just so organic. It was never something he wanted. He never wanted a career in politics, but he came back radicalized from that British experience. He led the campaign to try and get asylum for Snowden in Brazil. That almost worked, but it didn't. And then from there on, everything that he did was always showing he was willing to throw his political career away in order to speak the things he really believed in and to set an example for how discourse can be done. And for all the powerful people and famous people who showed up to David's funeral and who manifested in various ways online in the wake of his death, the thing that was really the most impressive to me was how many people who have no power and have no position and have no privilege who talk so movingly about the effect David had on them, including the team of nurses who took care of him for the last 9 months when he was in an ICU bed, often not able to speak, who came to his funeral and who told me that David was so much more than a patient to them, but was this true friend who had changed their lives. Only David, of all people I know, could actually do that. And just to kind of share a couple personal insights quickly. I wrote an article, I think about 2 months ago, at a moment when David was actually getting better. And we had been told after that first week 3 other times, once in November, another time or October, the first time, another time in December, another time in February, that it was extremely unlikely that David would survive the next 48 hours. 3 times his doctors called me and told me, prepare for what is almost certainly to be David's death in the next 48 hours. And I had to tell my kids that and take them to the hospital to what I thought was saying goodbye. And yet he didn't die those 3 times or that first week. He fought so hard to survive and to stay alive. And as a result, he gave us months to be able to be with him and reaffirm our love and to say the things to him that you want to say to somebody before they die and that they want to say to you. Those were some of the most profound and moving moments we had in our marriage and had in our relationship, and it gave the kids so much of an opportunity and his friends, and that all came from David's fighting. And one of the things I realized from that is there's so many things we take for granted in life that are the things that we value most. I often thought about what happened on August 5th, which was the day before David went to the ICU for what would be the last day that we had together at home, unbeknownst to us, and how often probably we passed each other without saying anything, might have bickered over stupid things. And then I got to the point where when David was actually awake and communicative, I was able to spend the day with him just chatting, just talking, just connecting to him. And it just reminds me of how important it is to have gratitude for all the things that we value in life, because everything is temporary in this life in its current form, in the form that we experience it. It's all going to be taken away from us at some point, and then we're going to die. And so remembering to always embrace all those things with so much gratitude is so crucial. And even with David's death, when the sadness comes, when the pain comes, when the loss comes, I try very hard to not think about it as something that was taken from me and focus on the pain and the sadness from the loss, but instead to focus on how grateful I am that I had the opportunity to share my life for 20 years with someone so extraordinary. So I encourage you to read that article. It's one that I wrote when, as I said, I thought David was getting better. There were so many times when he fought so hard that we really believed he was on the road to recovery, even though the doctors kept warning us not to believe that it was unlikely that he would recover. His strength was so immense that he was able to fight through all of that. So yeah, I think that's everything I wanted to say. Like I said, I would have felt odd, maybe even like a little dishonest, like I was hiding something or concealing something that's obviously very much on my mind had I not used this show to talk about David and the political side of David, the public side of David, but also where that started, which was from this immense strength of character and integrity and passion that touched so many people, and it was in the most improbable ways.